On November 11, 1918, the request for an armistice from Germany, ending World War I from the French side, was accepted by General Ferdinand Foch. Later, after reading the terms of the Versailles Peace Treaty, Foch stated that it was not peace but rather an armistice for 20 years. Winston Churchill himself vouched for the authenticity of this quote. As we know, Foch was not mistaken. The Second World War indeed followed the First. However, looking at everything that happened between the two conflicts raises a logical question. How did Germany manage to recover so quickly after its defeat in World War I? The answer to this question lies in several factors, starting with an unusual fact that few usually remember. Who actually said that Germany suffered more than France or Britain in World War I? On November 11, 1918, the day the First World War ended, the distance from the front line to Paris was just over 200 kilometers, while to Berlin, it was 1,900 kilometers. Despite subsequent events, one tends to forget the fact that Germany fought the entire war on foreign territory and essentially concluded a victorious spring offensive in July 1918. Yes, it was followed by an even more successful Allied offensive, but the essence lies not in that. The destruction of the trench warfare territory of Germany was not affected. Remember the regions where the main battles of World War I took place: Somme, Ypres, Verdun, Galicia, Jutland, Marne, Soissons. None of this belongs to Germany. It could have lost the war however it liked, but the ruins predominantly lay not on German territories. The aviation of those times did not allow for deep air raids in Germany, and regions like the Ruhr, Rhineland, Silesia, Poznan, and many other industrially developed regions remained untouched. This cannot be said about France's industry. By 1914, Germany already controlled 40% of the resources. The main problem for Germany during the war was blockade and food shortages, but by 1918, the factory stood, and the workers were ready to toil for pennies amid an economic crisis. Therefore, the question of Germany's recovery after World War I needs to be sharply distinguished, and it should be understood that the conflict itself inflicted much less damage to the country than to France. The key issue lay in the drafting of the Versailles Peace Treaty, which you've probably heard was ambiguous and aided German resurgence. Later, the revanchist sentiment would reignite the flames of the Second World War, but it's not fair to blame those who drafted the treaty. In 1945, everything was straightforward. Germany lay in ruins, and the Allies physically marched into Berlin. But in 1918, if you were to ask an extraterrestrial, they wouldn't understand which side had actually lost, let alone how to compensate for the damage. On one side, France, the USA, and Britain wanted to dismantle Germany and impose reparations for 500 years ahead. But who would pay these debts in a torn-apart country? Germany couldn't bear too many reparations, nor could leaving too many result in a paradoxical situation where the loser felt better than the winner. Add to this the USA's loans to Britain and France, where almost all German reparations had to go overseas. Hence, the problems of the Treaty of Versailles stemmed from finding a balance. The initial version of the treaty inflicted the most damage on Germany. This led to hyperinflation, massive strikes by Germans unwilling to work for France for free, and political instability. By 1924, Germany had to lower payments to avoid default, but France threatened and even occupied 7% of the country's territory in January 1923. The situation worsened, leading many to realize it would end in either a new war or Germany's bankruptcy. France tried to mitigate by demanding Saar, the Rhineland, and the Ruhr, placing them under external control by the USA and Britain. However, lacking a common border between Germany and the USSR pushed the two countries towards cooperation, alleviating tension and possibly uniting against a common adversary. The catalyst for Germany's economic resurgence was the Dawes Plan on September 1, 1924. The USA and Britain intervened, relieving France of the burden of German contributions, restructuring the payment system to match Germany's economic capabilities. Loans were given to Germany for development, speeding up the return of contributions. The result was remarkable. By 1923, Germany's industrial production reached 55% of the 1913 level, rising to 122% by 1927, with unemployment dropping almost to zero. Despite losing territory in 1928, German per capita income surpassed pre-war levels, and its economy outpaced France and Britain's. In 1922, the Rapallo Treaty between the Soviets and the Weimar Republic normalized relations, forgiving debts, nationalizing enterprises, and more. Economically and in terms of national consciousness, Germany returned to a European level by the late 1920s, mainly through U.S. loans. When the Great Depression hit America, Germans suffered the consequences, with GDP and incomes plummeting, destabilizing the fragile political situation and paving the way for an Austrian artist to rise to power, a figure often associated with these events. In reality, 80% of the credit for the country's recovery was actually laid by the Weimar Republic, with the remaining 20% attributed to the old-fashioned government debt policies of Keynesianism. From 1933 to 1939, the government's total income amounted to 62 billion marks, while expenditures reached 101 billion marks, leaving a terrifying budget deficit. Hitler openly stated that it would be liquidated by conquering territories, and indeed, that was the crux of the entire economy. However, the situation with the army, people, and technology was much more intriguing. Unlike money, you couldn't just print them, and supposedly, according to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's army wasn't reduced to atoms. So where did the resources come from in 1939? Here, everything is much more complicated than with the economy, but essentially it boils down to the fact that after World War I, Germany's army essentially remained intact. Yes, on paper, it was limited in quantity and quality of equipment, but in reality, the same dismissed officers were doing the same things, just supposedly in civilian positions. In 1923, 10 years before Hitler came to power, the Aviation Inspection was established, ensuring that military pilots were trained in civilian and sports schools, learning to fly military planes on passenger Junkers aircraft. By the end of 1923, fighters were purchased in the Netherlands, and secret training schools were set up in Lipetsk, where German military pilots secretly trained. Similar secret schools in the USSR were built for German tankers in Kazan and Himikov in Volgograd. However, their significance is often exaggerated. For example, only 220 German pilots graduated from the Lipetsk Aviation School, while more than 2,000 were trained in the secret Brown Shirt School in Germany. In general, statistically speaking, the foundation of the Wehrmacht of 1939 was actually created within Germany itself, just unofficially. This is why when Hitler came to power and military cooperation with the USSR collapsed, Germany didn't feel much change because, as with the economy, the army's foundation was laid by the Weimar Republic. Walter Dornberger, for example, received orders in 1930 to create a liquid-fueled rocket, which later transformed into the military V-2 rocket. The civilian airline Lufthansa supposedly suffered huge losses according to documents and logically should have been closed by the government. But in reality, this didn't happen because Lufthansa trained future Luftwaffe pilots on civilian aircraft. Hans von Greim, the creator of Blitzkrieg and one of the most successful officers of the Wehrmacht, practiced tank maneuvers in 1919 on the Polish border using trucks, getting into a tank for the first time. Militarization was rampant even in the calmest periods of the Weimar Republic. Moreover, many lean towards the opinion that it was precisely the lack of secrecy and technology that prompted German generals and engineers to seek original ways of conducting military operations, which ultimately resulted in Blitzkrieg, rockets, and the nuclear program. In 1931, German journalist Karl von Ossetsky published a series of articles exposing Germany's secret militarization. For this, he was persecuted by both the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich. Ultimately, Karl ended up in a concentration camp in 1933, and the Nobel Peace Prize he received in 1935 didn't make his life any easier. Von Ossetsky died in 1938. Nearly 5 years before that, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, officially announced the creation of the Luftwaffe, and completely lifted the restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, total militarization of the economy on borrowed funds and a budget deficit that was planned to be rectified by war is how Germany actually recovered after World War I. Initially, there was the peculiar Treaty of Versailles was full of contradictions and the inability of the Allies to negotiate properly. Then came the Dawes Plan, followed by Hitler, who found everything ready and just accelerated the economy towards war. It's worth noting that even in 1939, France and Britain surpassed Germany industrially. The reasons for France's capitulation.